It is my pleasure to introduce Jay Michaelson. Jay is a writer, scholar, and activist whose work focuses on the intersection of religion, spirituality, sexuality, and law. Jay is the author of 4 books. His most recent book is God versus Gay, The Religious Case of Equality. He's an associate editor of Religion, He is associate editor of Religion Dispatches magazine, a columnist and contributing editor to The Forward, the founding editor of Seek magazine, and he's a regular contributor to the Huffington Post, Cocoon, Hadassah, and the Reality Sandwich magazines. He is editor of Aza Yashir Moshe, a book of songs and blessings. Jay has been a visiting professor at Boston University Law School and has held teaching positions at Yale University and the City College of New York. Jay is the founding director of Narim. It's a GLBT, Jewish Culture and Spirituality, a nonprofit organization which builds community for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender Jews, partners, and their allies. Jay is known for bringing a religious voice to bear on questions of LGBT equality and for finding common ground between people of different opinions on the issue. Please welcome Jay Michael.
So I've been going around the country talking about this book, God versus Gay, The Religious Case for Equality. And I realized that there's a Jewish joke behind every book that I write. And the joke behind this one is that we Jews have a way of indicating when it is that we want to speak. We interrupt. So, not that I necessarily want to put that into practice this morning, but I realized that I did put it into practice in the writing of this book. And I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the process of this project's gestation in my own life, and then talk a little bit about the book itself. Yeah, there's something really, I think, holy about that interruption that kind of does mark a lot of Jewish conversations, at least the ones that I've been involved in. It does have a lot to do with our wanting to express our opinions, but it also has something to do with that righteous indignation when something is wrong. You know? When we see injustice or a story of injustice, we interrupt. When we're told a tale, a myth that doesn't accord with our own experience or with the real serious experience of the people around us, we interrupt. Okay? And the Jewish religious tradition is one of God wrestling. It's one of interpretation. The Talmudic rabbis understood that you even interrupt the voice of God itself, as they do in one of the stories in the Talmud, when it doesn't accord with how we understand our religious obligations. It's, I think, a really important kind of religious orientation to keep in mind. It's certainly one that animated the work that I'm doing. I'm just wondering if any of you have ever had an experience where things turned out exactly the opposite of how you expected. And that was certainly my experience on coming out as a gay man. I thought that coming out was going to be the end of my religious life, and it turned out to be the beginning of my religious life. I thought when I was living kind of an Orthodox lifestyle, a very, very traditional Jewish lifestyle for many years, I thought that if I were to come out, my friends would desert me, my family would abandon me, and most of all, my connection with my religious tradition, with God, with observance, all of those things would disappear. And I really thought that God versus Gay, I mean, it's not just a book title, it was what I lived for many years. And so I chose God over gay for most of my 20s. There's something really wonderful about a traditional religious lifestyle because it really is holistic. It involves your whole self. But what it enabled me to do was postpone asking kind of the tougher questions. I mean, the questions were always there. It's whether I was willing to actually interrupt the story that I was living. So finally, after 10 years of living that way, I switched sides. I decided to pick gay over God. It's kind of funny, this isn't really in the book, but I was hiking in Israel. I lived in Israel for 3 years. I was actually hiking on Mount Sodom, which seemed like a good place to have a conversation with God about my sexuality. I don't really have that many conversations with God. I do come from the Jewish tradition. I know there are folks from all different backgrounds here. And as infrequently as I talk to God, God speaks back even less. So maybe that's a good thing. But I did have a conversation on the top of Mount Sodom with God. This is about 12, 13 years ago. And I said, I've tried it your way, and it's not working. I've tried to change. I was in relationships with women that didn't work out for one reason or another, mainly because I was gay. And I tried it, and I finally said that, this is how it is, and too bad, now it's going to be this way. And little did I know that that was actually the beginning of my spiritual life unfolding. It was only after that I was really able to dig deep. I used to teach Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. I dug really deeper into meditation, into Jewish practice and Jewish life, and became involved kind of as a professional, a Jewish professional. In the Jewish professionals say professional Jews, but I realized outside that little field it's a weird thing to say. I became a Jewish professional and really made it a real part of my life. It was exactly the opposite of what I expected. And I thought, we all go on our journeys, whether they're journeys of self-acceptance or wherever that takes place in our own lives, religious journeys, personal journeys, professional, career journeys. There's always, all of us, as we're alive, are in transitions, and those journeys move on. Right? We go from one step to another, to another, to another. But as part of the work that Bruce was mentioning, I started this organization called Nihirim. The name means lights. It's an LGBT Jewish organization. I was having the same conversation that I had 10 years ago, over and over and over and over. Meeting folks who were just struggling with the same God versus gay contradiction that for me was old hat, right? That I thought I was over that. But as a community, we're not over that. There are many folks, there are some folks who are definitely committed to a certain reading of tradition, and they're never going to move from that position. Fine. And there are other folks who are already marching at the Pride Parade and being supportive allies, and that's great. But there's a whole lot of people in the middle, who are sincerely struggling with traditions around sexuality, and not because they're closed-minded or something like that, but because seems like new information. Religiously speaking, our understanding of human sexuality is extremely new. In Jewish history, when we learned something 100 years ago, it's like yesterday, right? One time I was talking about lesbianism, for example, was never even really mentioned in Jewish law until the 12th century. And I said, so that's comparatively recent. People in the group were kind of, right? But in Jewish law, 12th century is, the day before yesterday. And so understanding about gender and sexuality in the last 100 years is really recent. That's like an hour ago in Jewish time. So people are wrestling with this issue not because there is some sort of block or because they're backward, but because this understanding is new. And in many people's case, extremely new, like the last 5 years or 10 years. So we're at square one because this is really one of the defining issues of our moment. But I think, and I'll explain why in just a moment, I'm actually really optimistic about the nature of this whole debate that our society is having in America around sexuality and diversity. I actually think it's a really sacred debate. Again, in the Jewish tradition, there's a notion of a dispute for the sake of heaven, l'shem shamayim. And this is not seen as a bad thing, right? It's actually seen as a positive value to have an argument or a controversy if it's for the sake of heaven, which means not for the sake of making your opponent look bad or putting people down or finding a way to weasel around the law, but really, actually, for the sake of truth. Right? However we understand spirituality, if we're religious or not, theists, atheists, surely being an authentic person has something to do with truth, right? With honesty, with integrity. I look back and I think, of course, coming out was a religious act. Because whatever God is, it must have something to do with truth, right? But at the time, I really didn't understand that. I'm going to spoil a Hollywood movie now, but it's an old movie, so it's okay. The Sixth Sense, remember The Sixth Sense? With Haley Joel Osment as the psychic child who can see dead people. So the dead people in The Sixth Sense don't know that they're dead. They think that they're fully alive, just like I thought in my 20s. And it wasn't just around sexuality, closeting myself from my whole way of being, of loving. And how can we be authentically religious if we're closed off from the possibility of love? So I wrote this book. Because the conflict of God versus gay, which I thought I had gotten over, and in which I'm sure some folks here in this room have gotten over, whether on the God side or the gay side, it's actually it's a false dichotomy. And it's a deeply hurtful and painful and divisive one. Religious people should support equality not despite religion, but because of religion. So yeah, I understand there are a couple of verses which may or may not apply to same-sex intimacy. But there are thousands of other teachings which emphasize the importance of justice, love, equality, compassion, integrity, honesty. These are the values which are impacted by how we are as human beings. So really the book is, and the way I'd like to suggest we see this issue, it's a two-step process, but we sometimes only focus on the second step. Right? The first piece is, what are the fundamental values which we bring to bear on this particular question? Some of them I've just mentioned, and I'll go into a couple more in just a moment. Then we can say, okay, how do we approach this or that verse? Okay? So a lot of the times I kind of talk about the book and somebody says, well, what about Leviticus? Or in Christian traditions, what about Romans? What about Corinthians? And that is a real question, but that's the second question, not the first one. Also, and this may be surprising to some, the second question is the easy one. It's easy to find interpretations of these verses and traditions and teachings which are liberating rather than repressing. Because the verses themselves are ambiguous and unclear and limited. I'll give a parallel example in case that seems radical or like, isn't the Bible really clear? No, the Bible's not really clear. And even when the Bible is really clear, it's not really clear. So it's Sunday. I don't know if any of you have kids in Sunday school right now, but now we're in Sunday school. What's the sixth commandment of the 10 Commandments? Thou shalt not kill, right? It's usually how it's translated. Really, thou shalt not murder, right? But in the King James, 4 words, very clear, thou shalt not kill. Hebrew 2 words, lo tirtzach, thou shalt not commit murder. Well, what is murder? What does that mean? It can't really mean thou shalt not kill, right? Because just a couple of chapters after that 6th commandment, there are examples of wars in which the Israelites are killing people. And that's seen as a good thing, whether we see it's a good thing or not. But the text sees it as a good thing. And a few chapters after that, there are examples of capital punishment for violations of all kinds of laws. And that's seen as a good thing. So even something as so crystal clear as thou shalt not kill, no exceptions, clear, easy, even something as simple as that is actually subject to interpretation. And it's meant to be that way. Right? The Bible's not meant to be a look-up code, like where you just easily look up all the easy answers, right? It's meant to be the frame of the conversation. Because the conversation, the debate, the interruption is itself the sacred value. Right? Now, if we're in, let's say, a traditional community, an Orthodox community, that discussion is bounded in ways that it's not bounded for others. So we're restricted by precedent. We're restricted by how rabbis and others interpret the texts. Right? But the conversation still happens. Change may happen more slowly, but it has to happen. Just like there's been change around the inclusion of women in traditional communities, including Orthodox ones. Just like there's been changing around new things which come along. There is the internet, surprisingly, is not mentioned in the Torah. So when it becomes part of our lives, we take that 2-step process. What are our fundamental values, and how do we apply them to this question? Right? Whether it's the internet or the existence of sexual diversity. So what are some of the fundamental values that apply in the case of sexuality? So here's the second Sunday school question. You ready? You did okay on the first one, but maybe a little more coffee needed. I don't know if we can maybe bring some more coffee in. Right? What's the first flaw in creation according to the story in Genesis?
It's not good for Adam to be alone.
Wow, see, look how much better we did that time. Right? It's not good for the human being to be alone. Right? Congratulations. You got the star. Also. Which is really striking, actually. If you read the Genesis account, God says the character of God, and just if the God piece isn't working for you, it's just a work of literature, right? It's just a story. The character of God says over and over and over again, it's good, it's good, it's good. Everything is good. The tree is good, the sky is good, the stars are good, everything is good. Man, humankind is very good. And all of a sudden in Genesis 2, chapter 18, it is not good for the human being to be alone. It's really striking. It's not like a marginal aside, like the child of Methuselah or something. It's pretty central, right? So how many times, has anyone heard the anti-gay, the taunt, it's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve? Anyone heard that, right? But Adam and Eve were the solution to a problem, and the problem is aloneness. Right? The story doesn't talk about Adam and Eve in terms of procreation yet, doesn't talk about gender complementarity or any of these other kinds of, it talks about aloneness and the need for another person to heal that primal gap, that rupture in the human condition, the existential quality of being alone. So when I approach a verse or a teaching or a tradition, the value of the holiness and importance of love and intimate connection impacts how I read those other traditions and verses. So if I have a choice between an interpretation which leads to more love and more sacred relationship, or an interpretation which leads to repression and people harming themselves and exclusion, well, then I know which one is more consonant with my fundamental values. Right? So actually, the readings of the verses, the words and the nitpicking and all that, the pro-equality reading doesn't need to win. It just needs to tie. Right? Because it's not really a tie. So I don't need to find the most plausible reading or the most grammatically correct reading or even the reading that the most people have taken over time. I find the one that makes sense, that honors the text and respects it and promotes the most love, intimacy, etc., etc., etc. Or take another value. Take the value that I mentioned before of honesty, of integrity. Right? Which reading of these traditions promotes the most honesty and integrity? We have this notion of the closet, right, where people sort of reside as they're questioning their sexuality or hiding their sexuality. I think it's kind of a misleading metaphor. I mean, as a gay man, I love my closet, right? My shoes are in there, right? It's a great place, right? I really like the closet. They're kind of cozy, But at least my experience of the actual closet was not that pleasant at all. Right? It's more like a tomb for me. And everybody's experience is different, but my experience was that it was a place made out of lies. I mean, really imagine lying to everybody you know all the time about something that's very important. Now, how could a loving God want the tyranny of the closet? And again, that all too cozy metaphor for something that's not cozy. And so it goes, the notion that there is a loving God. How could a loving God want this suffering? The notion that we're required to not just be satisfied with justice, but to pursue justice. And when inequality exists of any kind, it's a religious problem in need of our human action. Okay, so what about the bad verses? So here come the bad verses. So in Leviticus, this is the easy part, right? It's the less interesting part. It's the part which doesn't actually require that much of our religious reflection and introspection. But when I turn to Leviticus, first I notice it only applies to men. And actually it was never applied to women in Jewish law. The prohibition that does come in the 12th century about lesbianism comes from a totally different source and is actually a series of associations which I think any modern reader would find preposterous. Okay, so that's 50% of the problem has just disappeared. That's great. Right? Then I see that it only applies to one particular sex act. If you know the Jewish traditions, they're not very squeamish. They don't mince words. Rashi, the biblical commentator, very clear on what the word alliance of a woman means. Right? It means one particular sex act between men. Okay, that narrows it still further. And then I look at the last two words in the Hebrew, to'evahi, which is usually translated what? Homosexuality is an abomination, right? I call this the A word. Right? Abomination is a mistranslation. It's in the King James, and it's come into our lexicon, and I can't say over and over and over again in Christian and Jewish religious communities when I talk about this, and there are folks who are skeptical, but doesn't the Bible say that homosexuality is an abomination? Fortunately, I have a clear answer to that question, which is no. Right? The Bible is written in Hebrew. It was not written in English. Abomination is not in that text. The word to'eva is. Fortunately, the word to'eva is actually used many, many times in the Bible. Hundreds of times, in fact. Except for the book of Proverbs, which is a special case. It's almost always about a cultic observance, about something about idolatry, and it's culturally relative. This is the important part. I don't really know what an abomination is exactly, but I think it has something to do with something that shouldn't exist on the face of the earth. This is my rough idea of what an abomination is. So, I don't know if anyone watched The Simpsons, the TV show The Simpsons, right? There's a fish on The Simpsons that has 3 eyes because it lives in the waste of the nuclear power plant. That to me is an abomination. Lime jello, right? Things which don't exist in nature and shouldn't exist anywhere else. Sorry if I just offended the lime jello people. Right? But toeva is the exact opposite of that. There are things which in the Torah are toeva for Egyptians, but not for Israelites, including, by the way, eating with Israelites. Now, I don't know about you, but if eating with Israelites is an abomination, my family has a long way to go, right? Passover Seders, Rosh Hashanah dinners, Shabbos dinners, right? So obviously eating with Israelites is not an abomination. It's a culturally relative taboo. That's how I translate the word toeva, taboo. Now, does that mean it disappears from importance? No. But I don't know, has anyone visited the website godhatesshrimp.com? Take a look. You can download these posters. They look just like the God Hates Fags posters, except they say God Hates Shrimp, because that also in the King James translation is the word abomination. Right? So whatever homosexuality may be, it's of the same type of prohibition and the same type of severity as a shrimp cocktail, which no doubt is why we see so many religious right protesters outside the Red Lobster all the time carrying their posters. Now again, for Orthodox Jews, that still is an important prohibition, right? But let's at least classify and see where it fits into the system, right? One particular sexual act between men as a culturally relative taboo, and here's the last part, toeva, for Israelites, always has to do with idolatry. This is a ritual prohibition, not an ethical one. It's not about family. It's about keeping Israelites separate from non-Israelites. What are some other toevot, other things that are toeva in the Torah? Statues, altars, anything having witchcraft, sorcery. These are the things which are toeva. In fact, because this particular act between men is labeled as toeva, I see it as forbidden only when it is a toeva. Right? What's forbidden is not sexuality or homosexuality, but cultic homosexuality in the context of a non-Israelite idolatrous worship practice. Now, I don't know about you guys, that doesn't apply to me and my partner a whole lot. Right? We know this is the case because elsewhere in the text and in history and in archaeological evidence, in fact, there were Canaanite temples where you would go, and there were sacred prostitutes, men and women, who would take the role of the god or goddess in a kind of orgiastic sexual ritual. It's kind of more fun than Kabbalat Shabbat, really. And if the rabbis here are looking to spice up your congregational life, you could try some Canaanite orgiastic ritual. And we know that there were men who would enact this ritual with men, and that is precisely the cultic toeva, which this supposed prohibition on homosexuality in general actually has in mind. So this is a very narrow reading of the verse. It's literalistic. It's not figurative, it's not getting past it, it engages with the text, and yet it's one which applies to virtually, really no one today. Now, is this the only plausible reading of this particular text? And by the way, I could do just as legalistic and nitpicky analysis of verses in Romans and Corinthians as well, and be happy to do that if in the Q&A or afterwards. Right? Is this the only reading that makes any sense? No, of course not. You could also read the text really broadly and say this bans all same-sex intimacy, defense around the Torah, this bans everything. So you have competing options. If you were a visitor from Mars coming down to the planet Earth, you might not know which reading to take because there are multiple plausible ones. But we're not visitors from Mars, right? We're reading these traditions in the context of children killing themselves because of God versus gay, right? And how often after these tragedies happen do we hear the sort of denials of responsibility from clergy members and others? Well, I had nothing to do with that. This child was obviously mentally ill or sick or something. Even though I gave a sermon 2 weeks earlier in which I called homosexuality an abomination that should be eradicated, or that I said that sexuality was a choice or something that could be changed, or a lifestyle. I've always wondered what the gay lifestyle is, right? I don't have a lifestyle, I have a life. Right? Where intimacy and sexuality is part of that life. Right? So even though I just 2 weeks ago said all these things, nobody listens to anything I say on the pulpit, right? That's why I preach all the time, just to hear myself talk. Right? So all interpretations are not actually equal. because we're reading this verse in the context of other people. Okay? What's the number one, the leading factor that studies have shown cause folks to shift on this issue, let's say of gay rights or whatever? Is it being in a liberal family? Is it religious background? Is it socio? It's not. It's actually knowing someone who is out as gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender. It's knowing somebody as a person, as a human being, which is why this is a consummate religious question. Right? This is what we do as ethical adults, as human beings. We reinterpret and re-understand in the context of our relationships with others. This is why Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig saw the other person as revelation. Right? This is where we learn in our encounters with other people. No matter how many times religion is used as a tool of oppression to beat down various groups, whether it's other racial groups or ethnic groups or women, right? The conscience itself, the operation of religious conscience itself, has the seeds of undoing that very oppression. Which, by the way, is why I bother with the religious consciousness at all. Right? There's something in the process of introspection that itself undermines the process of oppression. And we're seeing that right now. We saw it in the conservative Jewish movement, which there were people who said that the sky was going to fall if there were ever gay rabbis. Guess what? There's gay rabbis. The sky hasn't fallen. And in fact, the conservative movement has, for the last few years, been able to finally, with this distraction out of the way, deal with the real issues that face the conservative movement. Who are we? What are we? How do we understand ourselves in the 21st century? Right? With this distraction out of the way, actually, much more productive conversations have started to happen. And likewise, just on LGBT people, too. Right? Now, instead of just asking, is it okay to be gay? We can ask questions like, what are the gifts that LGBT people bring to communities? Religious communities, secular communities, right? Just as the inclusion of women in religious communities transformed those communities for the better, so too, the inclusion of these voices which have previously been suppressed. This is for everybody's benefit. The image I want to close with is actually from Huck Finn. It's from Mark Twain's book, because it's exactly the moment of religious consciousness and formation that it resonated in my own experience and with this whole question. So I won't do this one as a Sunday school lesson. You may remember, or may not, that Huck Finn has been floating down the raft with Jim for a period of time. He's been told that if he doesn't turn Jim in, the runaway slave, that he's going to go to hell. Because you have to turn in runaway slaves, or you're going to go to hell. But Huck hasn't done it. He's delayed doing it because he's actually formed a relationship with Jim as a human being. Not as a runaway slave, but as a person, as a friend. Finally, though, Huck has a religious crisis. And he realizes he has to turn him in. He just has to. He doesn't want to go to hell. And so he writes the note. He writes down the note disclosing their location and is ready to turn Jim in. And then Mark Twain writes, he went on thinking. That's that crucial piece. He didn't just go with the immediate, what he's been taught. He went on thinking. And he considered the times that he'd shared with Jim, and the times where they saved each other's lives, and all the warm, really loving times that they'd had with one another. And Twain writes that Huck's saying, I was in a close place and I knew it, because I had to choose between two things. And he knows it. It's a choice that he has to make, ethical choice, to turn Jim in or not. And Huck says, I guess I'll go to hell then. And he tears up the paper. And we know, as readers, that this is not when Huck goes to hell, but this is exactly when Huck matures into an ethical adult. Huckleberry Finn's a coming-of-age novel, and this is when he comes of age. And precisely the moment that Huck thought would be his damnation is actually his salvation. Because sometimes things turn out exactly the opposite. I think I'll make an unusual citation by way of response, which is to the new book by Jay Baker. That's the son of Jim and Tammy Baker. He has a book called Fall to Grace. He's now an evangelical kind of preacher in Brooklyn, in fact. And he makes exactly that point, that you can read the whole text of the Bible as God's learning process. and also God learning to deal with God's anger management issues. God always is kind of wanting to destroy and destroy and destroy. And it's interesting, in the Jewish tradition, so Noah gets kind of a bum rap. We just read the story of Noah in the weekly cycle a couple of weeks ago. Because God says, I'm going to destroy the world, build yourself an ark, and Noah just does it. He doesn't argue back. Whereas Abraham, who doesn't even have anything at stake himself, God says, I'm going to destroy Sodom, and Abraham argues and does some negotiation, which ultimately doesn't save the city. But so it's just that contrast. I definitely agree. I think it's sometimes I'm asked the question, what about Leviticus? In a certain way, I understand it's the right question to ask, but it's also the wrong question, because the real question is, well, what do we do with these texts and traditions in a way that keeps them alive and keeps them responsive to our own needs as human beings? So, thank you. I'll just, you mentioned Sodom just really briefly. Sodom is also used much more in the Christian tradition than the Jewish one as the Ur text about sexuality in the Bible. Reading the story of Sodom as being about homosexuality is like reading the story of an axe murderer being about an axe. Right? It has nothing to do with homosexuality. What the story of Sodom is about is a radical violation of hospitality. It's a story about rape. It's not a story about sex. It's almost offensive to read a story about rape and think it's actually about sexuality. But don't take my word for it. Take the word of the prophet Ezekiel, who actually asks, what was the sin of Sodom? And answers his own rhetorical question. It says the sin of Sodom was pride, greed, and cruelty. And this is what the story was universally understood within the biblical text itself. So just as an aside, I didn't want to leave Sodom out there. There's a chapter on it in the book, but ironically, it's folks today who are suggesting that we need a little more cruelty and toughness in our public life who are the true heirs of the Sodom tradition.